for more on the tensions between NATO and Russia. I'm joined by William Courtney. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia. He's also a senior fellow at and executive director of the RAND Business Leaders Forum. Welcome back to the show, Ambassador. We're seeing these announcements of military movement, the sanctions, a lot of tit for tat. Are we watching a Cold War unfold here?
It won't really be a Cold War, but it is a cool war. Russia is becoming more authoritarian at home, and this has been correlated with its more aggressive stance abroad. But it looks like Russia has reached too far in eastern Ukraine. It took Crimea bloodlessly, but in eastern Ukraine, it's met a lot of resistance from the Ukrainians, and Russians are now, wondering whether they've gone too far or not. There are a lot of competing pressures in Moscow. NATO has responded by trying to increase deterrence against Russian aggression by raising the cost of Russian aggression. So Deputy Secretary Carter this week said that more equipment will be put in the eastern members of NATO alliance. NATO Secretary General just said today, reinforced that we're not seeing from the NATO perspective a new arms race, but we are going to stand up for our allies.
Is Europe really that concerned to have NATO push all this military hardware? You have the exercises, the number of troops that they've been talking about. Does NATO feel like they have no other choice, or is it really just trying to send a message to Russia?
Well, it's greatly to send a message to Russia. But NATO is now discovering that it hasn't talked about deterrence and dealing with a threat from Moscow for several decades. And so we're seeing some odd things. For example, a new Pew Research poll last week showed that Germans, Italians, and French, a majority of them, don't favor using military force to defend alliance members. Now, those numbers are not to be trusted because if there's a crisis, NATO will lead and the leaders of those countries will marshal support for it. But right now, we're seeing a fair amount of confusion in NATO about the direction NATO ought to be going with regard to military pressure vis-a-vis Russia.
Could we see some conflict among NATO alliance members if it gets to that point about how to proceed?
No, in the past, NATO members tend to come together. You'll notice even Greece, Prime Minister Tsipras has been to Moscow several times recently, but even Greece has gone along with the sanctions against Russia. The NATO members tend to coalesce as one when there's a crisis. And the Russians have tried to split Europe from the United States and NATO, and they've failed, as they have failed in previous crises.
Something very important on the horizon happening in regards to Iran and the nuclear talks happening there. How could the tensions between Russia and the West affect this deadline that is coming up in regards to sanctions in Iran?
Well, tensions could cause Russia to be less supportive of the Western approach in dealing with Iran. But the Russians have multiple interests. One is they don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons south of them. The Russians are concerned about Islamic nuclear weapons, if you will, and Iran is kind of an aggressive Islamic state. So they've been generally supportive of Western approaches to Iran. If there is a nuclear agreement, though, Iran will start exporting more oil on world markets, and that could reduce the price further, which could hurt the price of Russian oil. So there are several conflicting factors.
All right, Ambassador William Courtney, as always, we appreciate your insight. Thank you so much for joining us here.
You're welcome.
Let's take you live now to a joint news conference at the U.S.-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue taking place at the U.S. State Department. That's Jacob Liu speaking. Let's listen in.
And sustainable growth for both our economies. It is critical that China remain on a path toward a more market-determined exchange rate and a more transparent exchange rate policy. More broadly, our economic discussions over the past 2 days have focused on a few concrete areas. Creating benefits for both our citizens by expanding opportunities for trade and investment. Implementing China's economic reforms to ensure sustained balanced growth in China and a more rapidly growing Chinese market for the goods and services of the United States and the rest of the world. Cooperating to support and strengthen the international financial system, including by upholding the highest standards, and coming together to tackle the most pressing global issues of our day, including climate change. We've also had candid conversations about standards of behavior in cyberspace. We agree there is value in bilateral and international cooperation on these issues. It's clear from our discussions over the past 2 days that China's leaders are working hard to reform China's economy and growth model. This ambitious set of reforms is needed to reorient China's economy towards domestic consumption and away from exports, heavy industry, and investment. Implementation is still in the early stages, but already we're starting to see some progress. Let me give a few examples of progress that we've made at this year's S&ED. With regard to exchange rate reform, China has committed to intervene in the foreign exchange market only when necessitated by disorderly market conditions and to actively consider additional measures to transition to a market-oriented exchange rate. We welcome China's commitment to publish economic data under the IMF's SDDS template by the end of the year, and the explicit recognition that it's in China's own interest to adopt the transparency standards of major reserve currencies. On information, communication, and technology issues, China has committed to ensure that regulations in the commercial banking sector will be non-discriminatory, will not impose nationality-based requirements in the commercial bank ICT space, and will enhance policy transparency in this area. We will continue to push China on this priority. On the bilateral investment treaty, both sides have reaffirmed that the negotiation of a high-standard bid is a top priority in our economic relationship, committing to intensify negotiations and exchange improved negative list offers in early September. We also had candid discussions on China's national security review, including our concerns regarding its broad scope. We're also pressing for regulatory certainty under the National Security Review to avoid retroactive reviews and discussing our concerns regarding possible recognition of third parties. With regard to the financial sector, China committed to reforms, including taking the final steps in liberalizing interest rates, opening capital markets, and expanding access to foreign financial service firms and investors. By shifting resources to China's households and private firms rather than state-owned enterprises, these initiatives will support China's transition to consumption-led growth that creates opportunities for U.S. workers and firms. On climate and energy cooperation, both sides agreed to use public resources to finance and encourage the transition towards low-carbon technologies. We're also determined to work constructively together to support the effective operation of the Green Climate Fund, which we both recognize as the main dedicated multilateral climate finance fund. We further agreed to finalize our G20 fossil fuel subsidy peer review by the end of 2015. We welcome these important steps that China's leaders have taken.
And you're looking again at U.S. Treasury Secretary Jacob Lew speaking at the 7th Strategic and Economic Dialogue here in Washington, D.C. Also, this follows the CEO summit that happened earlier today. This was day 2, and they are